Good evening, broadcasting live from the northern wilderness. I bid you all a good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be across the continent, around the world. I'm Campbell, and this is the Invisible Night School. For those of you just joining us, INS was founded by a small group of researchers and scholars analytically exploring the study of paranormal phenomena, epistemology, and the cultural and social implications of UFO phenomena. INS is not a monolith. We represent varied ideas, backgrounds, disciplines, and experiences, and seek to engage in good faith dialogue with other curious minds. Now, let's bring on my co-hosts, Louise and Nick. How you guys doing? Louise, what's up?
The sky.
Very nice. Nick, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm all right. Let's just point out the obvious. Leah Prime is not with us tonight, but she will be here next week again, and the world will be right again.
Yeah.
Now,
no woo tonight, though.
Well, let's find out. Yeah, let's not draw a line in the sand yet, Nick. Let's see where the night takes us.
We do have a UFO topic tonight.
Yes, people have asked for labels. I've got my Guinness right here. Anybody else drinking anything right now? Pepsi. Okay, nice.
Pepsi. I got
Starburst, Louise.
I got coffee too.
No, nothing.
Double fisting it. All right.
Well, let's move on to the guest this evening. Tonight we have Curt Collins with us. Curt writes about UFOs with a special interest in reinvestigating the paradoxical 1980 Texas Cash Landrum case. He is the author behind Blue Blurry Lines, a website focused on the UFO mystery, as well as its legends and hoaxes. In 2015, Curt was on the investigative team, the Roswell Slides research group, that exposed the Be Witness alien photo fiasco. More recently, he launched The Saucers That Time Forgot with Cloud Falkstrom, focused on unearthing tales that UFO history has overlooked or would rather forget. Curt, welcome to the Invisible Night School.
Thank you.
Finally got you on here. Well, now, I'm familiar with you through the blogs that Campbell read in your intro, but what is this research team with the Roswell slide story? I'm not familiar with that at all, and I'm not sure if the listeners are either.
Well, the hoax that Roswell slides, it sort of died early, so not as many people have heard about it today. But in 2015, there was this big event held in Mexico, held by Jaime Maussan, and UFO researchers Tom Carey and Don Schmidt were consulted by this media guy who had discovered this picture of what he thought was a Roswell alien. So there was a lot of secrecy about it, and it was supposed to be the smoking gun, and it was going to prove the reality of Roswell and extraterrestrial life and everything. So a few online friends, Isaac Coy, Chris Rakowski, some skeptics, Tim Prenny, Lance Moody, Paul Campbell, some other people, S. Miles Lewis, several others. Kind of gone blank on everyone, but we sort of formed an informal group to see, what can we learn about this? And eventually, a trailer came out for the thing, and it had a small shot of the alleged alien slide at an angle. Well, a couple of people, including one of our members, a French member, uses the name Nablator. He took it and stretched the image to restore it to because it was laying at an angle, to its proper proportion. And you could kind of make out what it was. And it looked, it was a body, strange looking body. And we started saying, well, what could this be? Is it a dummy? Is it a doll? Is it something like a Fiji mermaid where they would take a monkey and a fish and sew it together? Just something like that. And we found some pictures of some mummies that looked very similar to this, but it was low resolution, so we really couldn't tell. We had some ideas. And there was this elaborate story that it was two individuals, Bernard. Gosh, I've forgotten his name now, but Bernard Ray and Hilda Ray, this couple were friends of the Eisenhowers, and they were given secret access to this to the alien body from Roswell. That was the legend. Well, we can never find any real connection between the people and that this legend of Eisenhower and everything else. So we weren't able to torpedo it before it happened, but after it happened, we got a clear resolution picture of what they claimed was the alien, and it was this huge production. Richard Dolan went to Mexico City for this 2-hour, however long presentation it was, and they had some people that claimed to be biologists that authenticated and say that it was it was probably a reptilian composition and not hominid as we know it. Anyway, so we got a copy of. So what was really odd about, and I should have mentioned this before, it looked like it was photographed in a glass case, and there was a little sign on it. It's like, why was it in a military institution with a label? And,
right, the CIA is putting a label on it. Yeah.
So skipping ahead, when we got a good picture of that label, it was blurry. It almost looked like it was in Sanskrit or something. But it turned out the person I mentioned earlier, Nablator, he took that and used this commercially available program called Smart Deblur, and slowly, as he refined it, because it's kind of a trial and error method to focus on it, the words, mummified 2-year-old boy, and eventually we learned that this was a New Mexico museum, and it was a Native American boy's mummy. And so all this mystery and legend, was built around this. So there's a lot more to the story, but that's the core elements.
So it turned out being a photo of an exhibit in a museum.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
And more like not so much, almost a roadside museum. I mean, in a park.
Right. I like that there was a lot of teaser trailers leading up to it and a lot of fanfare. The best thing you can say about the UFO community is it always seems we're on the precipice of something really exciting. Always, and then when the thing rolls around to disappoint, there's something to take its place. So that's always fun.
That's true.
Also, Curt, your write-up in Robbie Graham's book, if people want to check it out, it's pretty much all there, right? Or the whole thing.
Yeah. So that slipped my mind. Yeah, I was asked to write about the Roswell slide story for the book. It's in Reframing the Debate, and it pretty much go through everything in chronological order. So it's very detailed. And then at the Blue Glory Lines blog, I've got the photos that document the research that went into it, and you'll see the actual pictures from it. So yeah, it was quite a yarn. And because it happened in Mexico rather than the United States, it was all over with pretty fast. Adam Dew was a promoter, and he had a partner, Beeson, and they had planned to do a documentary and merchandise and everything. And they were violently opposed to our conclusions. And but after that, it pretty much dried up and went away. And it's seldom talked about these days.
Curt, in your experience with this subject, to what extent is there intent to deceive in these kinds of circumstances? And to what extent is that intention one or two core people who then have a inner circle who are also misled, or is it a larger thing? What have you sort of seen consistently occurring in this subject?
Oh, well, that's pretty complicated. There are a lot of people that are genuinely interested, and they are propelled by the beliefs that they develop. And a lot of these beliefs are shared by groups and everything. And there's a whole, they're basically, to some people, UFOs actually are a religion, but to a lot of people, it's not so much that, but they have these certain beliefs that serve as tenets of faith. And it drives everything they do and the way they interpret the evidence. So there can be honest people that within that framework they're misled and they misled other people. Now, on the other hand, there are people that are charlatans and outright fakes. A few years ago, I learned about a term for the first time called a pious fraud, which you may have heard of. It's like in the case of in the case of a priest or something that fakes a miracle to help build the faith of the followers. He sincerely believes he's doing good and is lying to do so.
It's an important distinction.
There's some people like, I think George Adamski, who's pictured behind me, he might be someone like that. He had these spiritual beliefs, and I think he used ufology to sell the message. So where he had preached before, this theosophical type of message, and that was all spiritual. Well, then the way it was adapted for the flying saucer audience is the messenger, the divine messenger, came in a spaceship instead. So it was repackaged, and it reached a lot more people because of how popular flying saucers were.
Do you think that Billy Meier is like that? Pious fraud?
I don't know. It's entirely possible. Now, I've heard people argue that Meyer and Adamski had genuine experiences, but in order to promote the message, they hoaxed. So I don't necessarily buy that, but that's argument that people want to find some credibility to them somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question here from Jeff Knox, Vancouver guy here. He says, can Curt tell us who is directly behind him? The book and face.
Well, that was Frank Scully. So, we've got here in my head, there's Kenneth Arnold, and then and there's Donald Kehoe, Frank Scully, and George Adamski. Mm-hmm. So they're sort of like all founding fathers of ufology for good and bad.
It's interesting. You don't have Ray Palmer in there?
Oh no, that we would have to expand it. We'd have to get Charles Ford in there. We would have to get Meade Lane, and on and on. So this was an illustration for a particular article, and all these guys were tied to UFO books. So that's the particular reason for choosing them. But yeah, there are many other cooks in this for this too.
I imagine. I mean, that's a little bit what you go into on your second blog, right? The Saucers of Time Forgot. That's actually the blog that we connected with, kind of the early sightings and stuff. And that's something I've started looking into really recently. So I'm a bit of a novice for that kind of era, especially like 1947. I hear you mention Charles Fort and Meade Lane and the Fortean Society and stuff like that. Pre-47, pre-Palmer sighting, were there reports of saucers back then, or was the description saucer completely post Kenneth Arnold in your research?
Sorry, there are a few minor examples of saucer-like craft, but that's the exception. You really have to dig through. And, people have found a few that, I think in the 1800s, but the saucer really came about with Kenneth Arnold. And the year before Kenneth Arnold, there was a story. Now this is connected to Meade Lane, his group. Over San Diego, there was what was appeared to be a bat-like, or maybe a plane with flapping wings. And this, there was some kind of astronomical event that had more people outside, and so there were channelers involved, and Mark, how do we say his name? Probert. Yeah. So he made contact with the being. Actually, he made contact with a spiritual being who seemed to know about him, and said that there were visitors from another planet, more like another dimension, a planet in another dimension. And they were here to observe us, but they were afraid to make contact because we're such a violent species. So this was a spaceship, an alien in contact story, almost a year before Kenneth Arnold's story.
Yeah.
And, there were some headlines in the newspapers that, a spaceship sighted and that sort of thing. But it was, well, there was a channeler involved, so I don't. Depending on your beliefs, how much stock can we put in that? So
was that Probert? Did that saga happen in California?
Yes, San Diego.
Yeah, there's a lot of this Californian Adamski as well, but many people are sort of in the subculture, the California subculture, like the New Age wave, and many of them were influenced by Theosophy, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. So if your viewers may not be familiar with L. Sprague de Camp. He was a science fiction author, did a lot of historical work. May have heard of him from editing the Conan books in the 50s. So he wrote a book called Lost Continents, which is great. It's a lot of it is on Atlantis and some of the other legends of lost worlds and things like that. They're close, very close ties to UFOs in that. And he shows how Theosophy, helped develop the legend of Atlantis, and especially the advanced technology version of Atlantis, and all that's very, very close to the early UFO beliefs. And those same sort of people were early adopters of the extraterrestrial hypothesis as it came to be known.
Now, if I could just step in for a second, we have Leah in the comments, and she's saying she just got engaged, everybody. So that's really nice. She took the night off for domestic bliss.
Congratulations.
That's really cool. Got a bunch of congrats rolling in here. That's nice.
Nice.
Just wanted to highlight that. Thanks all. Love you. Enjoy. Curt. That's nice. Awesome. Okay.
Well, okay. There's nothing else to talk about. That was such big news.
Yes. Well, actually, that's a great. You published was it yesterday night or this morning a piece about UFO eyewitnesses and the way that they should be treated. Would you mind getting into that for a minute and just sort of summarizing that for us? Because I thought it was a pretty good read. Yeah.
Yeah, so Leah is partly responsible for that. I had been thinking about this for some time. I found this article in an old MUFON journal by Dr. Peter Rank. And Peter Rank was a radiologist who consulted on the Cash Lanham case, which is how I became familiar with him. But in this article, he talks about how, well, in particular, he was addressing the case of Dr. Leonard Stringfield, who, before Roswell was resurrected, he was examining these stories of crash retrieval stories and referring to a lot of military witnesses who claimed to have witnessed things. And most people weren't taking it too seriously because all his witnesses were anonymous. Well, one of the witnesses that was later identified, and maybe the only one, turned out to be Jesse Marcel. Well, that's kind of a side note. So we know at least one of those was a real person who was involved in a flying saucer story to some extent. But so some of the people criticizing Rank were Stanton Friedman and Bill Moore, author of the Roswell incident book. Dr. Rank felt he's spoken in the defense of Stringfield, and he said that he thought it was really important to respect the anonymity of UFO witnesses, and that their privacy, had to be protected. This unwanted attention had destroyed some people's lives, and including some of the policemen who have reported the incidents. Their names are a matter of public record. The attention that they received and the ridicule, destroyed their careers, or, whether they actually destroyed their careers and they're just so uncomfortable they didn't feel like they had the respect of their colleagues, they left the business. So he thought a way to do it was handle it like they do in medical studies or when you're treating patients for studies. Share the information, the details of the case, protect, keep the witnesses anonymous. So, he wrote a nice piece about that, which I reprinted the bulk of. And I thought, well, another benefit of that is all these people who hoax UFOs, for example, your George Adamski types, their goal is really to become celebrities to carry their message. And by, if they have a story and they're not given this publicity, well, then it may remove their incentive for promoting these hoaxes. So I think, there's the articles at the site, and you can examine. You know, it certainly is more coherent than I'm trying to recount it now. But I think it's an interesting thing to consider. The other side of that is there has been a lot of abuse in the past with anonymous and unnamed sources. So you have to make sure that you're basically have someone who serves as an editor, a trustworthy person that can verify, has seen the information, knows this is a real person and it's credible. So that's a sticky point. Ufology isn't to the point where it's professional enough where you have these resources most of the time for someone to serve as an editor.
That's an interesting point. And that was on your Saucers That Time Forgot blog.
This one's at Blue Blurry.
It was at Blue Blurry Lines.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to circle back because we've touched on it a few times. Do you want to tell us about Blue Blurry Lines and how you got involved with the Cash Landrum case? I know that Luis has got some opinions on that case as well.
Sure. Well, okay. I'll try to make this real quick. So that involves my re-entry into ufology in 2011. I was a big UFO fan as a kid, but it was basically a flavor of entertainment to me. The library didn't have a lot of UFO books. I read the ones that I could find, and other mysteries and things like that. But I grew disenchanted with it in 1980, and really didn't return to it beyond watching the X-Files until 2011. I saw this documentary on Gray Barker called Shades of Gray. And in it was James Mosley, who was the ufologist who had Saucer News in the 1950s and 60s, and later had the Saucer Smear newsletter.
Yeah,
and he had a real sense of humor about the UFO field. And I got in contact with him, my first contact with a real live ufologist, and we became pen pals and talked to him on the phone a lot. And I wound up being a contributing editor to Saucer Smear. Oh. And he was the one that introduced me to the Cash Landrum case and thought that was one of the most credible cases ever. So I started sending him information on the case. And when I was doing independent research, more than he could publish. And so the blog eventually grew, it was a place to share that information.
Mm-hmm. That's a good outlet because I, in my experience, when I was researching the Lake Michigan case, how we originally connected, I never know when to stop. My original point with it was to make a video or something or get attention on the case, and just keep finding more and more and knowing what to do with that information and storing it all and putting it out there. You need a good outlet for that. So maybe a blog was what I should have done in the first place.
We'll give it a try. It really helps to process the information and to see that it's shared. Maybe not everyone will read it, but in not so much in the Cash Landrum case, but in the Saucers That Time Forgot, I'll write about an old ufologist talk, and occasionally a relative or children or grandchildren will write and say, "Oh, that was my family. I was involved in that." And in a few instances, there's been additional information surface. Rarely, but it's an open channel in case there's anything out there.
Well, so where do you come down on the case? Do you think it's as compelling as Mosley did?
Cash Landrum? Well, that was a real education for me. So it was investigated by John Schuessler, who was the deputy director of MUFON, later on the director and a lifelong board member. And I think he's only just recently disassociated from the group. And he had just his background, he was a McDonnell Douglas engineer, worked on the space shuttle program. And he was also a ufologist and had besides his involvement in MUFON, he had a group called VISIT, Vehicle Investigation System Team, something like that. Anyway, the whole mission there was to the terminology they used for UFOs was unidentified spacecraft. So they had already decided up front that what they were investigating was spacecraft from other worlds. And it was just a matter of identifying them, learning about the propulsion and things like that. So
Sure.
that, reflects some of the things we talked about at the beginning. When you've already made up your mind, it shapes how you interpret the evidence.
Yeah.
So he got a hold of the case after APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization in Tucson, Arizona, was unable to investigate it properly. He lived in Houston. The Cash Lanham case was just outside of Houston, so he was close enough to investigate. He took over the case, and he really shaped the way everything was reported. He described the women as upstanding members of the society, and the witnesses as having run a successful business and everything. Whereas someone that said, like the typical press may have said, well, here were some couple of middle-aged redneck women. So he always portrayed it in he dressed things up like a dollhouse, and it was almost like he was given an idealized Hollywood version of the case from the very start. So I read his book, and at the time it was very hard to find, out of print. It was self-published. I don't know what, maybe 1,000 or 2 copies were printed and circulated chiefly through MUFON and UFO conferences. So I found the copy and read it, and I'd already studied the publicly available information on it. And I was kind of aghast when I read the book because, it was a lot of things from his case files, and there were all these inconsistencies, and it was just, I thought, wait a minute, this is, I felt like it was a manipulated story. And to me, it just, the beliefs I had about the case, the faith that I had put into his work and everything else before that kind of crumbled. And then the more I learned, the more disappointed I found. And, ultimately I found like, we will probably never know the real truth about the case, because we've got this fairy tale that we've been told, in the time, the distance. And it's like, well, if the case is now indistinguishable from a hoax. So that, and I feel like, and I don't want to single out John Schuessler in particular, but I think a ufologist can have this effect on an investigation. You're seeing basically their painting of the events, and not the picture of what actually happened, not a photograph.
That's a good way to put it. Now, you mentioned APRO earlier. Wasn't Rick Doty kind of feeding information via Bill Moore into APRO about this case in particular?
Well, yes, not just that case, but yes. So
right.
APRO, I'm pretty sure he was feeding them an early version of the myth that it was a secret government aircraft, and he laid the UFO was was flown from Texas, from out west, later revised to Area 51 as a point of origin. And then the later refinement on that was that it was a Bob Lazar style alien reproduction vehicle, which either, and then it varied as to whether or not it was actually the airframe from the aliens with our nuclear engine, and then it malfunctioned. So, there were some tall tales about that. He also claimed numerous things in error about who was involved, how many people were involved, who was, tested for radiation. And he also claimed that the witnesses were secretly receiving funding or some kind of compensation and probably treatment for their injury. And that was flatly not true. And that was the witnesses' entire motivation for coming forward and continuing to speak about it over the years, is because they felt like something was owed to them. So that was one big hole in his story. But yeah, and Doty to this day, still one of his, you let him talk for any length of time and he'll talk about his involvement or his knowledge of the cache lantern. And I haven't found a shred of truth in the things that he says about it.
Typical.
Can you talk about the Iranian hostage connection that you found, or the possibility of that?
Well, I wasn't the first person to discover this. I mean, and I don't mean to say discover. It's the incident took place while the hostages were held in Iran. And when did that start? 79 or 78 through 80. I guess it was 79 to 80. And there was a helicopter mission that was launched that failed, and there was a second one that was planned, and it involved helicopters, some of the type that were reported in the cache lantern case, and they trained from Area 51, which got into the newspapers a little bit because of that connection with the rescue. But they were training in the probably spring, or at least the summer months, maybe into fall, in 1980 before the incident, and including places in Texas. So there were, now in the cache lantern case, which I've skipped around actually describing it, but the UFO was seen by the witnesses when they were out on the road. They were driving home they had looked for a bingo game, couldn't find one, had dinner at a diner at a nearby city, and were driving back home to Dayton. They were actually close to Huffman, Texas, which is a small town. And they were along this very sparsely populated road. It's described as deserted, which is an exaggeration. Anyway, they saw this bright object that was huge, bigger than a water tower, they said, and they stopped the car. And they felt heat, and the light was incredible, and they initially could not describe it because it was blinding. Lit up the whole area around them, and it made this huge noise. And then as it left, helicopters started flying in, and they eventually stopped at a couple of locations along the way. And they said they saw 23 helicopters, most of which were double rotor helicopters, which later they identified from pictures, identified as Chinook helicopters. And they thought they might have been Air Force helicopters. The Army was operating those type of helicopters. Some of those helicopters were used in those training missions for this second planned Iran hostage mission. It happened to have been the hostages were released on when President Reagan was inaugurated in 1980. And so that mission never took place. And it already had been, I think that they knew something was happening, and it was called off. And the cache lantern case took place on December 29th, 1980, and between Christmas and New Year's. And basically the military bases were on a skeleton crew. So if it was, as some people suggest, a military exercise, it wasn't from a regular base. It would have to be drawn from special forces and teams, and each helicopter would have to have a crew, and each helicopter would have a crew of people fueling it and mechanics getting ready. So it would have to be a huge undertaking. If there were 23 helicopters, you're easily into 100 or 200 people that would have known about it to equip it and fly it and things like that, refuel it. So it's pretty unbelievable, the number of helicopters when you get the number of people. But yes, the Army did own the equipment in question, but it's just very unlikely that they could have been activated and sent to the location in time. So it's that's one of the reasons that it remains a mystery. I mean, there's never been any proof that helicopters were actually involved. And some ufologists have even spun that. Some even at the time, like Bill English of APRO, who was not one of the more credible ufologists, he suggested that the helicopters were actually UFOs or a projection from the UFOs to provide cover and camouflage. And then something not only a couple of notches different from that, when a search was made, the Fund for UFO Research, which some of you know about, your listeners, I'm sure, they laid out funds in support of UFO research. One of the projects they funded was a search for the helicopters in the Cash Lander incident. Alan Hendry of the Center for UFO Studies, understudy to Dr. Hynek, he now this was done by telephone, but he checked every base, helicopter base within range all over, and could find nothing that corresponded to this. And other people tried later. There was an investigation by the Army itself, and they found that inconclusive. Well, since no helicopters could be found that were involved, no people, Dr. Hynek came to believe that maybe this was some kind of, if this was more of a psychic event, maybe this was like a holographic projection or something like that, and that the helicopters were not physically real. This was, in the late 70s, there were a lot of paranormal type beliefs overlapping with UFOs, and Dr. Hynek was influenced by this. And John Alexander, who is a comrade of Robert Bigelow, he also holds a similar belief to that. It's not something I subscribe to. I don't know. Another possibility is that the event was genuine. Maybe there were some helicopters, and that the story was greatly exaggerated by the witnesses. That's a possibility.
Louis, you usually mention to the claims of radiation sickness as well.
Yeah.
Right?
So that it could not have been ionizing radiation, because it would have, if they had experienced those symptoms that quickly and to that extent, they would have inevitably died.
That's right.
They couldn't have been from that.
Betty Cash suffered hair loss, and in some accounts, later accounts, she's saying that it happened the same night. But as it was originally reported, and we have enough documentation to know that it was about 2 weeks after the event, and it was diagnosed as alopecia areata, and that's not that uncommon. She had other skin problems and things. She had blood tests done at the hospital, and they didn't show signs of ionizing radiation. So if whatever caused their health problems came from the UFO, it wasn't because of a malfunctioning nuclear engine. We can plausibly eliminate that. And the ladies asked for the help of their local government, and the Texas Department of Health's Radiation Bureau went out and checked the location. And so one odd thing about that was the witnesses and John Schuessler on their behalf were unable to pinpoint the exact location where the event took place. And you read any of the stories that Schuessler's written about it, and he says they did locate it, and they went there and photographed it. But when they were telling a government body that was investigating and trying to help the witnesses, they said they couldn't. It was only two landmarks. It was between a beer joint and a highway sign of some kind. So anyway, the Texas Department of Health went up and down the road with a Geiger counter, found no traces of ionizing radiation. Now, admittedly, this would have been in the event itself, was at the end of December, and then the investigation was I think that was in early September of 1981. So, but there should have still been some traces of radioactivity had there been some, even if it had faded.
What about Steve's question there about if any public comments from family or friends of Betty and Vicky about the case? Have those been made?
There's been a few. There was a book written by a gentleman, and it was like angels and aliens. It was a real spiritual take on, and he had called the family, and he didn't quote them directly. He said that the people that he spoke to believed that it was the words were actually radiation from an atomic plane, or words to that effect. So they believe, as the witnesses have said, this was Vicki Landrum's family, that it was a government project, secret government project that malfunctioned and leaked radiation. Betty Cash's daughter has appeared in a couple of documentaries. She's supportive of her mother's story. As the few that I can think of are all supportive. So there's not. Now I've seen some news stories that were written in the 80s around the town, and this is the time of the events. There's some people that hadn't even heard of the event, and some others just found it unbelievable. So there was the people who were not as close to the family. Some of them were indifferent to things.
Even if there were no radiation, there was no like significant radiation exposure or residues at the site wherever the thing happened, could it have been like a Nova linked technological, like a sighting of that, like the Nova test area? Well, the Nevada test site.
Yeah, so I know some of what the letters of what NERVA stands for, nuclear energy. Beyond that, I don't know. But basically, they were trying to build a nuclear-powered nuclear-powered airplane at one point. Stan Friedman actually worked on that. He said that it was unsuccessful. And one of the things was that the shielding that was required to protect the crew was so heavy that it made it impractical. That was one of the things. Now we do have nuclear submarines, but airplanes, as far as we know, never, were never viable. So I think that's very unlikely. And so then we have to talk about there are a lot of details about this case. We could do the whole show on this, but I'll go to a few things on this. So. Whenever the U.S. military does not build cool flying projects and hot rods just because they can. Almost every time there's a contract, it's to serve a particular purpose, like the U-2 was, or the SR-71, or even the spy satellites and the balloons and all these projects. They have a specific job in mind. And the stealth bomber, all of that. And sometimes by the time, typically, there's about a 10-year development from concept to prototype, and sometimes it's longer than that before working field model is done. So if the Cash Lantern UFO was a government project, we have to ask, what was it being made for, and what purpose did it serve? Who, where was it built? Who flew it? All these things. And then almost everything that has ever been built has eventually been declassified, or there have been leaks. And sometimes it's been exposed because of deployment. It's been used somewhere, it's been cited, and then we learn about it. So I think all these things kind of argue against the reality of the UFO as a secret government project.
That's a good point. I mean, we can clearly see with this case, as you put it, it gets distracted. The waters get muddied over and over. Each, enthusiastic ufologist comes and paints their own picture, and they all kind of get layered on top of each other. Do you see that as an issue with a lot of old cases, just waters being too muddy to actually get a clear picture of?
Yes, I think that's a big problem with cases, particularly ones that have, in the case of the Cash Lantern incident, have been like owned by one ufologist. And part of the reason for that was, especially during this time and even in the 70s, that the Travis Walton cases was another one that was kind of fought over. The UFOs, the Center for UFO Studies, and MUFON didn't think much of it. APRO investigated the case. They were involved in it. They were territorial of it. And there were these turf wars over things, over cases. There would be fight over it. There was everyone was pledging to share information, but the good cases, the interesting cases, and the ones that sold tickets at conferences, were really rare. So that they would guard this information, and they also had a need to promote it in their newsletters and conferences. So another part of or something that reflects on your question is the fact that, well, it has to do with the beliefs. And actually, I forgot my actual point, but about beliefs. Something really curious about the Cash Lantern case is that there was this feedback cycle, because John Schuessler, because of his reputation as a NASA scientist, he would investigate and he would take Vicki Lander to the approximate location where they thought it was. And he said, "So how far was it?" And she said, "Oh, from about here to there." And so he would take a tape measure or pace it off. And he said, "Okay, it's whatever it is, 200 yards." So then the next time would ask, she would say, "Well, it was 200 yards." So he would he would interpret the information. He was an authority figure. She would accept it. And he produced this homogenized version of events. Colby Landrum, who was almost 7 at the time of the incident, he thought that the object was diamond shaped. The women said they couldn't describe it. Well, after the first few stories of the press, well, he had some definite information. Maybe saw it better than they could. So they started describing it as diamond shaped. So the story changed, and it was almost as if they read their own stories about them, and it shaped how they told it from then on.
Absolutely. I mean, I know the case as a diamond-shaped craft coming down and burning these women in the car. I mean, I know it from Unsolved Mysteries, but yeah, the narrative changes. It always seems to change. And I mean, you look into a lot of old cases. How do you get down through those exaggerated narratives and find kind of the core of that? And then what resources do you use and would recommend to other, budding enthusiasts?
Well, in the case of the Cash Landrum story, there are early newspaper accounts. I eventually got hold of all the case files from MUFON and was able to go through and see, what was said initially, and you see before it becomes homogenized or romanticized or whatever. So, whatever primary evidence there is now. In older cases, we've got the files of Project Blue Book. So, and there are interviews with witnesses. Sometimes there's photographs and things like that. So, you have to put aside maybe the interpretation of the investigator, but, look at what the witnesses said. What was actually said at the time, if they made sketches, primary evidence, wherever it exists, whatever you can get, whether it's the first newspaper story. The thing that you want to avoid, most of us initially hear about UFO cases from a book that does, like a digest version of a case, or a television presentation, and there's always some kind of simplification. And I mean, even when someone, the most well-meaning, just like paraphrases what a witness says, it changes the tone of what it said. And then some people just can't help themselves from being like a storyteller. Well, if they stop the car, well, then someone else will say, well, they were too frightened to turn around, or they, just they're adding color to the story.
Was there a proliferation of diamond UFOs after that case?
Oh, well, that's Not that I'm necessarily aware of, but there was a really, really strange quote in the story before John Schuessler had investigated. A local reporter, Kathy Gordon, interviewed the witnesses. She got in touch with John Schuessler and asked him his opinion of the case. And he said, well, he was particularly interested in diamond-shaped UFOs. He had looked at a record of over, whatever it was, 200, say, and he thought that was significant in some way. So, and in his book, he talks about some other diamond-shaped UFOs. And what was really, really curious about that is there was one reported, I'm not sure if it was within the same month, but it was that winter in 1980. And the witnesses had mentioned a diamond-shaped UFO. But we're thinking a diamond like on a deck of, on the corner of a deck of cards. They were talking about an actual cut diamond that was faceted, and that I don't think they saw it clearly enough, but they were trying to describe the way the light reflected off of it, multicolored. But the word diamond is what Schuessler seized on and said, aha, here's another diamond-shaped UFO.
It's interesting that has echoes of the Kenneth Arnold sighting in that, the way he was describing saucer-like movement, not saucer-shaped, but people just kind of grabbed onto that and went, that's interesting.
Hey, Curt, you see this in a lot of these cases where they get so confusing from an outside perspective, and Dr. Heine comments on this a little bit in his book too, that like the people who report these kind of things seem completely confused by what they saw, and they seem to struggle to even describe it, which is confusing from a perspective of creating a story that you want to be believable, especially with Cash Landrum. If I recall correctly, like it got some significant press because they were trying to sue the government, trying to demonstrate that there was something physically happening, and that's where the sort of challenge arose, was that demonstration. Like, do you have any insight after diving into so many cases on why the narratives would like be so sort of hard to believe for at face value, like the 23 helicopter? Like, you don't have to include that fact. What do you think's going on there?
I'm not sure I exactly follow your question, so I'll talk about something else. What if the Cash Landrum case had been discovered by a follower of Charles Fort? What if a Fordian who was just interested in all sorts of mysterious events and happenings, so instead of a ufologist, because they had this huge blazing object, they actually thought that it was a spiritual event, the involving the end of the world. I mean, this is what they thought was happening, the end of the world in flames. And the helicopters to them, is what influenced them later to think it was a military event. But that was their initial impression. And then they suffered these strange, Betty Cash was the one that mainly had the health problems. And whatever happened to Vicky and Colby Landrum was much less severe. And it has been suggested by some skeptics that Betty actually had pre-existing health problems, and Colby and Vicky, they were basically imitating her, or at least, they were in support of her story that they had faked their maladies. So anyway, aside from that, getting back to the premise, so what if someone had looked at it as a supernatural event rather than a space UFO? There's as much evidence for that, really. But in this case, we had a ufologist, and that's where everything took. I mean, and so in the introduction to Schuessler's book, he talks about he has a sort of a fictional preamble, and he talks about the space visitors have been here for some time. The government knows about it. and they can't do anything, and that there's kind of the subtext, and so that's his introduction, and that was his starting point. So he felt all along that's one of the reasons he always rejected the military explanation for the UFO itself. But he firmly believed the involvement of the military as far as pursuing it, and so the focus of the investigator has a big part of that. Okay, now remember something else I intended to say. I want to bring up something about the fact that the witnesses, how they shape things. No, actually, I lost it. Okay, something else.
Well, since you refused to answer my previous question, I'll ask another one. Why do you, well, I'll just ask it maybe in a simpler way. Why are so many of the people who report like the classic UFOs, like why do you think that they struggle so deeply with describing the object that they are trying to convince others that they saw?
Okay. In some cases, it's because it's really not that clearly seen. It's at a distance, or it's moving. I mean, a lot of the classic UFO encounters are flybys. They were completely unprepared to see anything. In the case of the Cache Landing witnesses, it was there in front of them for a long time. It was so bright they say they couldn't see it. They had a better opportunity than most people. This wasn't the typical situation like where sometimes even whether you're on the deck of a ship or you're in an airplane and something zips by that you, and then you turn to think, well, was it silvery? Was it if it was silvery, was it metallic? And in some instances, something like that could be a balloon carried by wind and, was misinterpreted. But, depending on what you expect to see, almost everybody knows that there's such a thing as a UFO. A lot of people think that, hey, maybe I saw a spaceship. So that's part of it, is the expectations. And then if you're uncertain about it and you describe it to a ufologist, what's the ufologist going to do with the information? So you say it was round. Well, could it have been spherical? Could it have been, tic-tac shaped? Was it, they can kind of influence the witness in the questions they ask about it.
It's kind of like a game of telephone. You were just a moment ago asking if what if the Cache Landing incident was experienced as a religious experience, or through a different lens, and that made me wonder. And I think we've talked about this before. What do you see a distinction in the belief in religious beliefs and UFO beliefs?
There are some ufologists that are approaching this with good scientific methodology and that remain neutral. But I think that they're in the minority, and I think a lot of the people that are interested in UFOs are looking for validation for whatever their theory is, and the extraterrestrial hypothesis is a given for just a great many of them. And there are also some people who think, it may be something else, interdimensional or whatever. But again, they're chiefly looking for proof to support their existing beliefs.
Why do you think that the ETH is kind of the default, especially with people who you see a lot of witnesses claim this, that oh, I was never into UFOs and I saw this, and they kind of default on that ETH. Why is that, you think?
It's everywhere. I mean, it's in so many of our movies. I mean, it's been part of our culture for, since oh, I don't know. I'm gonna mark where it really entered our culture in the 1920s, and with the Buck Rogers comic strips.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the point at which not every home in the USA or around the world, but a lot of them were exposed to this sort of thing, this space adventure and fantasy, and and even Superman is a strange visitor from another world who came here in a crashed spaceship. So it's an easy thing for to fill a hole. And you were asking about religion. Well, superstition is close to that. And unfortunately, a lot of modern, the last 75 years, belief in UFOs is related sort of, whereas before, if there's a noise that you heard or a strange shape, it might have been a witch before. Well, now, is it a UFO from outer space? It's another boogeyman that lurks in the Mick West's term, the low information zone.
I seem to notice that UFO experiences as a whole kind of tend to, like, we've talked about this a lot, but like it mirrors our like social anxieties and our fears of technology and things that are kind of culturally going on now. And it seems to have done that through all the waves through history too. And I think that really speaks to the fact that it is kind of a cultural meme or a superstition that we all kind of default on and pick up even when we're not paying attention. I watch a lot of old TV commercials. It's a weird thing I do. But in each compilation from any decade, I do see a lot of ads that use spaceship, alien, and UFO imagery. So, I mean, I think when a lot of people hear people like us saying that this UFO narrative comes from pop culture, I think they're taking that and kind of understanding it as like, oh, I watch sci-fi movies, therefore I think I see aliens. And I don't think it's as direct or reductionist as that. But I think like that kind of ETH concept just kind of permeates culture from a lot of different angles, and it's really subconscious, and it's something we all kind of subconsciously share, at least in the States. I'm not as familiar with other cultures in other countries, but it's good to hear you kind of reflect what I've been thinking about lately in that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a matter of I agree with you. I don't think it's a matter of people not being able to tell difference between fantasy and reality at all.
Right.
I think it's just that if you've never flown a plane, you've seen it in the movies, and you may think you know what it's like, but you really don't. It's a placeholder in your mind, and almost everything kind of works that way. I mean, my first concept of a woman's body was like my sister's Barbie doll, and it turns out it's not that close.
Sure. But no, I do think it well, like all the concepts and maybe the features of UFO encounters also seem very human, right? They always kind of mirror, like I was saying, like what we are doing. You see the kind of like electrical interference qualities coming out of UFOs shortly after the Sputnik launches. But what happened right after the Sputnik launches is you see in the newspapers a lot of strange propaganda about Sputnik opening people's garage doors or changing the TV channels to Russian propaganda to hypnotize the masses and stuff like that. You see that kind of stuff mirrored along with these UFO experiences. You see in the 90s, as I think it was Senti's point out, in popular culture, what was going on now, the Genome Project, in vitro fertilization and stuff, and that was the big 80s and 90s were the big the hybridization program and the Greys and the abduction, and it was right on the heels of the Satanic Panic. It's always kind of like woven itself into our culture. Even look at Ariel School. These beings are telling the kids a very individualistic approach to climate change. Like, oh, recycle and stuff like that. Not let's land and tell the CEOs of these large companies that are polluting and actually contributing to climate change to stop what they're doing. Let's tell these kids. It's always very human ideas. It's always concepts that we already kind of subconsciously know as a culture too. So it never ventures off. It's what Lewis and I always talk about when we're talking about the alien movies, Alien and Aliens. I think Aliens made it not alien enough anymore. It's such a human idea. And I think we project our own kind of human creativity into these things as well.
Yeah, it's, at least in the way we interpret the events.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I have to ask, I believe that that the word believe is troubling, but
yes,
there are UFOs of some type, whatever the source. But there's also an incredible amount of mythology that's been crafted. Some of it has been purposely written, a lot of fantasy. I mean, that happens with historical events. There's all this apocrypha and rumors and legend and things like that. But some kind of, you mentioned in religion. Well, there are a lot of stories of encounters with angelic beings and things like that. And it happens to this day. And so our UFO contact cases are not that special. There are people that are seeing Bigfoot up close and things like that. This has happened throughout human history. Now, somebody like Jacques Vallée is going to say, well, that's the phenomena adapting to the ages and, how the humans can process the information. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but whatever it is, it's not people telling the stories about strange encounters, that does happen over and over. And now, we were talking about historical events. So there were stories, there were a lot of hoaxes of airships in the 1800s.
Right.
There were also some stories that seemed more credible, but people told about meeting the occupants of these airships, and there were people from other countries. And, these stories were really only outlandish in the fact that the airships had not been successfully built and flown at the time. It's almost as like, they're just like a couple of decades out of time and place. But, other than that, there's nothing that fantastic about it. But, so.
It seems like the stories behind this keeps moving further and further out to, because like you said, the airships were from other countries, then the ETs were from our solar system, but then we start to understand more, so they have to keep moving further and further out into the fringes of our understanding for us to even kind of go along with this whole narrative, it seems like. So now we're moving into even murkier territories involving appeals to quantum mechanics or consciousness, when these they're not largely understood fields or even agreed upon, so they can kind of hide there in the weeds, I suppose.
Those encounters with the fairies and aliens and even airships, historian Jerome Clark refers these to experiential encounters, in which and I've listened to him try to explain them. I don't quite get it, but I think he's saying that they're basically in the witness's head. But I think he thinks that it's a genuine phenomena. I don't quite understand it. So anyway, I give up.
There's a long history of people researching the UFO subject and then sort of coming to a conclusion ultimately that there is a tiny fraction of genuine, well, to use Arthur C. Clarke's language, genuine, hardcore real UFOs. And that is something distinct, as something novel, something that is not previously known. Dr. Hynek detailed the features of this subcategory that he believed made up a tiny percentage of overall UFO cases, and these are the genuine ones. He says no distinct point source lights, general fluorescent glow, oval disc shape, stunted dill pickle, shiny or glowing, never having distinct lights, yellowish white metallic. So it's a strange object that you don't think of when you think of UFO. It's like a generally glowing thing without distinct point sources. And that's, kind of interesting because it's consistent with these historic accounts of other like kinds of beings and stuff. And who knows if there's an actual link there. But in your opinion, Curt, do you think that there is like that like residual with those common features that Dr. Hynek described? Do you think that those are slightly off? What's your take on that kind of core residual?
I don't know. Really, there. So John Alexander likes to talk about, when you say UFOs, what kind? There's all kinds. And some people don't care about some kinds of them. Like some people think green fireballs aren't worth talking about. There were probably more legitimate scientists studying green fireballs back in the 50s than they were the flying saucers as the fans wanted to hear about it. So some of those things, there could be some atmospheric phenomena that are part of it. What if there are some little space warps that happen from time to time? I don't know. There could be things like that. We haven't solved all of science. I think the saucer-shaped spaceships from another world are probably that's probably not much of what we're seeing, if any. I want to take us back to the 1980s for just a second, to the Rick Doty and the Cash Lantern case, the Roswell case. All that stuff was happening at the same time, and it's almost as if the Roswell case and the Cash Lantern case were they were both being promoted at the same time. And one of the things they have in common is the underlying UFO beliefs. And one of the strangest beliefs about UFOs is the belief in just an incredibly competent UFO cover-up by the U.S. government, where they suction up evidence to the extent that whenever you don't get an answer from the government, and when no evidence is found, that is, in effect, proof of the cover-up.
Mm-hmm.
So, the lack of evidence is verification that it's a UFO event. So somehow,
always, yeah. Speaking of Roswell, you were mentioning Roswell being promoted at the same time of Cash Landrum in the 80s, and I think people less familiar with the history might think that sounds weird, but up until that point, Roswell wasn't really a story. It was resurrected in the 80s. Isn't that right?
That's right. There, you go through UFO history, and there's just very few mentions of Roswell. They'll say like, oh, well, here's this, there was this weather balloon. I think Frank Edwards mentioned it briefly. He said, yeah, and a UFO crashed into a mountain, and they said it was a weather balloon. Well, there was no mountain, so that story's off on a few counts. But yeah, it was Jesse Marcel was circulating the story. Leonard Stringfield heard about it. Stanton Friedman got a hold of the story, and Jesse Marcel was featured in the story. UFOs are real, as part of 20 other UFO stories. And he was a segment in the movie, and it was just another UFO story. So until the book came out, and it wasn't really until I think it was really Unsolved Mysteries did a story on it, when it became a household word. And that's when witnesses started coming out of the woodwork that claimed to have also seen the bodies. But yeah, so for anybody that isn't very familiar with the case, the original Roswell story if it was a flying saucer crashed, it was an unmanned one. There was no mentions of bodies anywhere. It was a funny thing. There was a Dr. Edgar Mitchell was talking about his memories of Roswell, and he was talking about reading about the bodies in the newspaper. Well, that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what did happen was in 1949, there started being stories told by Frank Scully that he had heard. We've later heard from Silas Newton about a crash at Aztec And it wasn't actually a crash. It was supposedly a meteor or something had knocked a hole in the hull of a spaceship, and then it had landed by remote control. And there were these 3-foot bodies inside, and they were later taken and examined. And so you had your alien autopsy, you had your bodies and everything. It was the subject of Scully's best-selling book. And it was in variations of it were all sorts of newspapers. There were in some versions of the story, it had crashed in Mexico. In some versions of the story, the little men wore Victorian clothing. It was huge. It really drove the flying saucer business, and it was eventually Roswell, in my interpretation, in around 1980, resurrected this Aztec story and brought it all. They redressed the story.
Could you comment? I just wanted to mention, Luis, we lost him. He mentioned that there was a storm going on in his area and he might lose power. So I assume that's what happened. But for Roswell, when I've looked into it, I've seen that they did the U.S. government did a pretty extensive inquiry into it in the 90s. And they ended up getting the Army, if I recall, to be pretty forthcoming, and sort of concluded that it really seemed, based on their own internal records, was one of these Project Mogul listening devices to hear distant nuclear weapons go off, similar to what they had in the oceans as well, that allowed them to know where the entire Soviet nuclear fleet was the entire time. So, with the internal records seeming to indicate, at least it would require like an extremely elaborate conspiracy. In your experience within sort of like the UFO community, speaking to people about this, there being so many people sort of founding their beliefs on Roswell, could you just comment a little bit about how you talk to people about that case when there's such strong opinions, and then also sort of like this historical record that we can look to independently?
Well, a lot of people now have grown up with Roswell. And as Nick said, a lot of people are unaware that it was a minor event, that, it was essentially retconned. They think that it was important all along. And that's simply not true. It was developed, it was built. And the book that sold it, the Roswell incident. Well, let me tell you a little story. This is fresh in my mind. So this kind of illustrate things. So William Moore, who, and most, he was associate of Doty's, and most people know he kind of left ufology in disgrace, and he accused a lot of people of being spies and things like that. I think what had happened was he found he was basically, some of his duplicity was being exposed, and so he did this as a cover story. Well, anyway, in the 1980 book, he cites a newspaper article, which he does not give the source for, where a journalist and historian of prominence, Fletcher Pratt, had spoke at a I don't know if he said it was a dinner or a banquet that was put on by a science magazine. And he revealed that he had sources within the government that told him that a disc had been captured by the military, that bodies had been recovered, and that they had been autopsied. And he said that whether or not this is directly related to Roswell, a person of Fletcher Pratt's status, who did have connections and knowledge about the government, that his sources must be good, and he wouldn't risk his reputation by saying that. So that was one of the incidents in the book to help support the idea for crashed UFOs. So recently, a few years ago, and I just re-examined it, there was a clipping from a newspaper from Burma, and it's the incident that this is based on. And the source for the news was AFP, which was, it was a French newspaper syndicate, and they distributed information to other newspapers. And there were two French newspapers that ran this story. And it was based on a speech that Fletcher Pratt gave December 31st, 1949 in New York City. Well, Moore's research and some of the things that have cited that, and that article that he had based that off, stopped there. Well, December 31st, 1949 was the New Year's Eve party for the Hydra Club, science fiction writers, of which Fletcher Pratt was also a science fiction writer. He gave a speech on flying saucers. The science fiction fans were skeptics by and large. Pratt was one of them. He gave a talk about the UFO news in the day. This was right when Donald Kehoe's article was released in True magazine. Flying saucers were in the news everywhere. As part of his talk, he gave a version of the Silas Newton story that we were talking about earlier. That's what was in that clipping. And Pratt's talk was summarized in very briefly in the New York magazine. And he said flying saucers were a big fake. That was how it concluded. Now, the French correspondent that picked up the story either didn't listen to the whole speech or didn't include that part. And so instead of discrediting UFOs, at least abroad, it repeated the saucer story as genuine. And then later, Moore, says it, a man of historian and man of Fletcher Pratt's status, so it's similar in a way to, there are probably at least a dozen newspaper stories about aliens and UFOs and flying saucers that have appeared on April 1st as jokes, April Fool's Day jokes, that have later gone into UFO lore, as including pictures of aliens and, the Silver Man was supposed to be a Martian. It's astounding, really.
Yeah, I ran into a really similar situation recently. I was looking into vehicle interference, and one of the big incidents, it was listed in several of the papers I was reading on it. It was originally quoted from Jacques Vallée. He was quoting a fictional story in a men's magazine, it turned out. But that kind of speaks to tracking down the sources for a lot of these stories is really complicated, and I know that you do quite a bit of it. I think you just posted an article about that, about it was an ad in a newspaper, Flying Saucers Over America. Where do you go? Where do you recommend people go to try to track down the sources for a lot of these claims? Because I think that's really important when you're reading a book, especially with a popular person like Jacques Vallée, and you're reading his sources. I think people should really look into a lot of that, because some of that can turn out to be complete bullshit. What do you do, since you've been around for quite a while doing this kind of thing? What are your go-to resources for some of this stuff? And how do you kind of cut through all that noise that gets added and built up?
Oh, it's a lot of work, first of all, but it doesn't always have to be. And now, okay, well, for one thing, try to flip through a book before you read it and see if it has sources that can be checked. And if it doesn't, it may not be worth your time. So that's important. And if it does describe an event, hopefully there are enough details that you can look it up somewhere. Okay, an easy resource that people can use is if you're curious about a UFO case, there's a NICAP site run by Fran Ridge, and it has a chronology of cases. Go there, and if you know what year it is, and hopefully the date and everything, you should be able to find some information on it. Yeah. All the major Blue Book cases, I think they have some information on. So that's one way. For something more modern, there have been a number of cases that were initially reported in something like the National Enquirer. So you're going to have a hard time finding anything solid on that. And what's so puzzling is in the like in the 60s through the late 70s, they actually did have some fairly credible UFO stories. They had Bob Pratt, a good ufologist, working for them. Now the headlines might have been sensational. The pictures, were exaggerated, but
Sure.
there was actually a person, and they're reporting a genuine event in most cases. So, but often there's nothing else. But there's a lot of great information now. So if you can't find the primary report, there are things like the AFU's archives. They're not always easy to search, but they have these UFO magazines that had sometimes interviews with witnesses that from the same month that it happened.
Yep.
But just that's one thing. Also is the UFO literature. Like I say, avoid the things that were done much later. The earlier you can get to the actual event, the better. So the Cash Lantern case, it was almost 2 months before the case was investigated, and before there was any real investigation on Roswell. It was 1978, and the thing, the alleged events took place in 1947. Right. So it's really hard with the time, the dilution of memory and everything else to get to it. So, if there's something, one of the best documented cases is the Socorro case in 1964 with Lonnie Zamora. You had people on the spot almost immediately. You've got the testimony. There's not photographs of the event happening, but you can get a flavor for the people involved and what happened, the way it was investigated. You can't actually know what happened, but it's as close as we can get.
Since you mentioned the Socorro case, what's your take on it? Do you think that I think you've probably heard the explanation that it was some college students pulling a prank with a balloon, right? What do you think of that?
I'm not sold on that. There was now I mentioned science fiction skeptics, a couple of them, and from Fletcher Pratt's club, Lester Del Rey and Jerry Pournelle, they had been put to a dare. Lester Del Rey had, by a ufologist, George Early. He said, "How can you dismiss UFOs if you don't investigate them?" So Del Rey spent about a year really looking into it. He actually traveled to Socorro with Pournelle, and he became convinced of the scenario of the hoax by the students. I'm not sold on it because there's too much stagecraft that would be involved. I mean, you have to have, Officer Zamora was chasing a speeder. He was distracted by an explosion. He went to investigate and then saw a UFO. I just find it highly unlikely that that requires too many conspirators. I just don't think that would work. And then you've got to, have the mechanics of whether it was, and how did he mistake a balloon for something with a ladder and the figures and suits.
I do wonder that, and I do understand like perception being fooled. Like I've seen an optical illusion. Obviously, I didn't walk away from that optical illusion, believing it the whole time. You know what I mean? So I know what you mean with that Zamora case. I'm not sure how I feel about it. I've also seen a similar explanation to the Portage County case with Dale Spauer. You were mentioning police officers retiring out of kind of like getting harassed. Dale Spauer is a good example of that. I saw another claim that students again and a balloon again caused that entire sighting, and I don't know where I fall on that either. I find that a little hard to believe too. Not that the the claims of that story aren't hard to believe. Hey, Lewis is back.
Hey.
You didn't lose power?
Yeah, it's back.
Okay, that's good.
It's a UFO.
or vehicle interference or house interference. No, we were talking about Socorro. Are you familiar?
Oh
with
yeah,
it?
yeah, yep.
What do you, Luis? What do you think about the story that was students hoaxing him with a big balloon?
I think it's pretty plausible from some things I've heard.
Hmm.
I think somebody who was a professor or something at the time has come forward now and said that yes, he was sitting on it or something like that, and he knew about some sort of hoax back in the day by students, and yeah, I think it was something like that though.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
There was also I don't know if you guys talked about it when I was gone, but wasn't it some other idea about that is that the lunar modules were being tested like sort of 20 miles away or something?
Really?
Yeah. And not the actual lunar modules. They never tested those on Earth, but
right.
the practice one that Armstrong and others were using. But I don't imagine it would like stray that far. So I don't know. I don't think it was that.
No, it's an interesting one though. It's a big favorite.
Supposedly it was relatively close by, but it didn't have the range. The flights were tracked, so there's really not much genuinely unearthly about the Socorro case. You know, it's technology that we could actually build. It's just like we were talking about the airships. It's in the wrong time and place. So, you know, so maybe that's more of a time traveler incident, you know, and not an actual UFO.
Mm-hmm. Been reading your Michael Swords. So if there's so many negative or at least like kind of like problematic elements that we've been describing, but you know, most people who get interested in the subject, it comes from like a genuine place of interest. A lot of the skeptics too, like Jason Colavito was a forum moderator on like paranormal of some kind, or at least Fortean. I don't want to say paranormal. Fortean. Yeah, back in the day, Mick West was getting interested in kind of all this stuff. That's why he started talking to people about contrails and got into it. Brian Dunning has a similar thing. That's why he called it Skeptoid, because he kept being called Skeptoid on the forums where he's looking at the Fortean stuff. What's inspiring and sort of optimistic and exciting to you, Curt, at this point in your engagement with the subject?
The people, the stories, and the mythology. There's one sighting that I really thinks that's really important. And it was genuine, whether it was an extraterrestrial spacecraft or not. It was 1949, April. It was Charles Moore. And what's funny about it is he became a skeptic. He dismissed both Socorro and Roswell. I think he supported the lunar lander type idea. And, you know, he was actually flying mobile balloons. So, but he saw back then in 1949 with a team of other people launching test balloons at White Sands. He was following the balloon that they had launched through a theodolite and spotted this oval-shaped object that you know, seemed to fly down and then back up again, moving at great speed. You know, and all the people saw it. He happened to be looking through the eyepiece and got the best look at it. And let me see if I can move here. No, going the wrong way. So this time, on Kehoe's book there, that's the shape. That's an imaginative rendering of it. But that's the saucer that or the ellipsoid thing that Moore and his people saw. You know, when you talk about trained observers, that was a group of them right there. And it was his testimony, originally anonymously as just a scientist, and then later, you know, actually with his name and title, and described. That was one of the earliest accounts of a scientist supporting UFOs in any way as being incredible, and it really helped boost the topic. You know, you had pilots and things. That was one thing, but you know, but here was a man in a white coat that, he was a UFO witness, and he wasn't crazy. He shouldn't have been. So that sighting has always interested me. And I recently, I mentioned this before, Barry Greenwood heard that I was interested in the case, and he sent me his folder on it, which included his correspondence with Moore, Professor Moore, including his sketch of the UFO. And I intend to write a story about that and publish that. I just think it's, of course it was drawn years later, but I just find the case fascinating. And that was one of the I kind of alluded to that earlier. It's not a hit, but it's a flyby and run. It's over and done. You don't really get that good of a look at things, but the way it flew, and and it couldn't been a balloon because their balloon was right there, and it obviously demonstrated. It's been just, there have been skeptics since have said, oh, it's a bolide that crossed the atmosphere of the Earth and flew out. But I'm not sure that I buy that. That's one that I take as an unknown. And I don't suggest any explanation for it. But I think that's one of the best UFO cases of all time.
Campbell, you love those bolides, right?
Not directly, yeah.
Yeah,
well, but that's a good point though. Like Dr. Valet and Dr. Davis have that paper from 2003, I believe, incommensurability, orthodoxy, and all high strangeness, and they talk about how there are these associations between meteor entries into the atmosphere and then observations of UFOs, and then they speculate about, oh well, maybe like the UFO is actually imitating natural phenomena. Maybe that's why they sort of have these strange forms. And my opinion, as most people here know, is that the intelligence reports from the USAF, CIA, and UK Ministry of Defense saying that they have personally concluded for decades that they think that these very anomalous ones are some kind of atmospheric phenomena. I think there's some evidence for that since ball lightning's been proven in the journals now. But, Curt, like, do you think, like, regardless of what each individual thing is this something that's just going to keep kind of moving on its own and sort of momentum now, regardless of like, short of like, disclosure, like the government coming out saying like, yes, this is actually what's happening, and that might even be conclusive. Like, do you see this ending, or do you think this is just going to be like something that goes on forever?
I think even if a class of UFOs was discovered to be atmospheric, there would still be other things that were seen. So I think it's basically we're stuck with it forever. And there's so many beliefs attached to it. They'll never die. So what's really strange is, of course we had the 2004 Nimitz incident, and there have been some other things which, now we're the Navy has really confused things by essentially calling unidentified aircraft UAP. So that, somehow UFOs and drones and balloons are all mixed up together again in a really strange way, and by officials and promoted that way. That makes things much harder to sort out. But with the government stamp of approval and funding, it's really revitalized the UFOs as a business. It's a big shot in the arm. I mean, see, that's one of the reasons that things that kind of died out. Well, it never died out, but there was a big lull after the closure of Project Blue Book and the Conan report. And scientific community had an excuse not to look at UFOs. But it's got legs with the public. It'll always be there. The Conan report reminded me of one thing I wanted to mention. So when debunkers take on UFOs, they're really not very discerning, and they paint everyone with the same brush. And they talk about contactees, they make no difference between a contactee claim of some, space ride to Venus with a person that's, has legitimate interest in UFOs from a scientific perspective.
Mhm.
They just, they just treat it like a circus, and it's all junk to them. And that's people talk about the stigma. Well, that's part of it. I mean, if you look at any topic, there's problems with it. In art galleries, there are fakes hanging alongside real masterpieces. The counterfeiting is a huge problem. There's fakery. I mean, so I'm not sure how much respect there is for the diet book industry, but how many of those are actually diet books are actually genuine? There's just, there's thousands of them.
Mm-hmm.
There's problems with just about any topic. It's really up to, I guess it's up to the buyer to sort it out and be aware that there are a lot of people out to trick you.
Mm-hmm. Talking about debunker bias and stuff, I can speak to personally. I've gone kind of through the believer to skeptic journey twice now, during my interest in UFOs. And it's when you get to that kind of skeptical side, it's very easy to fall into kind of the cynical trappings that come along with that, to kind of start writing things off and just thinking that it's all that way. And I think that skeptics' kind of cognitive biases get brought up a lot, but I think it's important to distinguish that like everybody in this field is bringing their own biases, whether it's bringing the ETH along with you or it's becoming or being a cynical skeptic. So I think we got to realize that we have different perspectives on all these things. We're all coming in with cognitive biases. That's a very natural thing to do it. But if you're aware of it, you can kind of work with them and work around them and not let them kind of take you down that path. But yeah, that I think it is kind of a fair characterization that you put out there.
Yeah. So the key offenders there, Michael Shermer and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Those would be the two that I would think of that typically take that approach. And they think, if you mention UFOs, they'll immediately just spring to one of the ridiculous examples. So yeah, it's an unfair characterization. There are a lot of, you go to a UFO conference, you'll find a lot of crystals for sale and all these weird, wacky beliefs and everything. But it's sort of the sideshow to a small, you won't find many serious UFO researchers at these conferences or even invited to speak at them. So I don't know. And speaking of conferences, the first ones were devoted to people like George Adamski and the contactees. So the NICAP tried to clean up that, but then it's always been a battle between the scientific desire and the sort of the fringe version. And that's always going to happen. You'll never remove that. And without the sideshow, I don't know if new people would be interested, entering the topic. It gets, it's terrible, but that noisy nuisances, those cases, are what gets on the news more often than the genuine ones.
Do you think that the noise is the signal?
A lot of times, yeah, it's definitely part of it.
I'm just pulling up your website here, Curt. Just wanted to show everybody. I was reading this article, the NSA Cache Landrum UFO document, and I just wanted to highlight how much information that's really neat that you find in your research. This is something I'd never seen before here. The introduction between Valet and Hal Puthoff, really neat.
Really cool.
Reveals how he met Dr. Puthoff, who also worked at SRI, so then visited the lab through that work. And then I think this is really interesting. Just in November 1973, Putoff told Valet that he'd found the leader of the CIA group that monitors the UFO field. Recently, a biologist was put in charge. Hal says the new man doesn't want to see me yet. In February 1974, Putoff called to tell me that this main intelligence contact was at his house. I meet him. Valet met Dr. Christopher Green, nicknamed Kit.
Interesting.
1974, and this is
Wow.
still something that we're seeing in the modern conversation. Kit Green is still doing things, and you were just describing the mixing of sort of the science and how it's been sort of minimized at the conferences and stuff. And would you be able, just with your knowledge about this history, would you be able to comment a little bit on like what you see as the issues with, like, these guys are real scientists, and then you know, they sort of created the grounds for this merger of the more new age with this. Could you just sort of talk about that process a little bit from your experience researching it?
Well, it confounds me. So some of the most respected names in ufology from this group, and you know, Valet, Christopher Green, Hal Putoff, you know, are involved in the psychic research, which they renamed, you know, just like flying saucers became UFOs and now UAPs. You know, it became remote viewing. It was a more scientific, more respectable name, and it took it away from witchcraft. But all, and as you scroll by there, I saw Dr. John Alexander. You know, he was heavily involved in the remote viewing program too. And, you know, some surprising people were. And they really dressed that up as science, but it was involved in some really kind of spooky stuff, and you know, which eventually took us to, you know, to jump several steps to Skinwalker Ranch and the supernatural tales that came from there. And so, but you know, there was a huge, one interesting thing about Roswell. It came along at a time where ufology in general was taking this approach to more like this paranormal explanation for UFOs. And Roswell took us back to the nuts and bolts and the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and sort of propped it up for another generation. But a lot of people that, you know, John Keel was one of them, that, you know, he had a more of a paranormal slant on things. He called himself a demonologist at one point. So, yeah, it's, I don't know. I can only note that it exists. It confounds me. I don't, it makes me wonder if they're as interested in the paranormal and psychic phenomena. Well, maybe the UFO aspect that they're also interested in was never as genuine as I was, you know, the package that I was sold, maybe that wasn't as genuine as I thought it was.
I get the impression that these people like Putoff and Kit Green and even Dr. Gary Nolan, I think that they legitimately might believe in this stuff. I think it's just, and you can have these people with degrees, these scientists that believe these things. I think it's the way they come to these beliefs that's the distinction, right? With math and science, that's all kind of deductive reasoning. There's actual facts to point to, but with kind of supernatural stuff, or you know, this kind of out there or woo stuff, that's all kind of inductive, right? It's an intuitional belief, like you internally and your feelings kind of lead you to these points. But those kind of beliefs can often be wrong. I mean, like, if I knew nothing and went outside during the day, I would say that the sun is circling the earth, right? And intuitionally, I would believe that because that's what my senses are telling me. And you know, that wouldn't mean I was necessarily stupid. I'm just observing my surroundings, right? So like, you can have degrees, you can be very intelligent, and you can be a scientist, and still, I think, have a place for these other kind of beliefs that don't necessarily follow that. And that kind of circles back to our like distinction of UFO beliefs from belief in, say, Bigfoot or ghosts or religions and stuff like that. I think a lot of people all over the earth have some kind of beliefs like these, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are open to basically magic of some sort or another. And as far as the scientists, having a PhD doesn't certify you as rational. There's been,
right.
Someone pointed out that, the Unabomber was a PhD.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
but one interesting thing about it is a lot of these people, Richard Haynes would be an example, come in and, they're experts in one field and they become interested in another facet in UFOs. It's almost as if, in the UFO topic, everyone's a beginner, and strangely they usually don't apply their training directly to the study of UFOs. It's some other aspect about it that fascinates them.
I agree with that.
There's an interesting feature with the scientists most deeply involved. Dr. Vallée, Dr. Hynek, Dr. Puthoff to some extent. They all seem to eventually move towards this idea of it being like the same thing as historical apparitions of fairies and stuff. Vallée appeals to Magonia, the castle in the sky, you get taken to and stuff. Do you have any intuition about like why that would be? Why, when people who are at the top of their scientific credentials would sort of move towards that most from an outside perspective, seemingly, I don't want to be offensive, but absurd sort of position?
So Vallée had a background that, he had a prior interest in he was a Rosicrucian and, some interest in the occult and things like that. And as far as Puthoff, he read Adamski's book in his youth, and he said it changed his life. So obviously, he was open to a lot of this. It wasn't as if these men were purely trained scientists and he said, "Oh, UFOs and psychic. Hey, let's look into that." They already had an appetite for that. At least in those two cases. And John Alexander, he had a military background. He said that he says he remembers the 1947 UFO events in the news. So, that apparently was one of his many interests, a lifelong interest. So, it's rare to find somebody who is basically a convert, a scientist that wasn't interested in UFOs. Dr. James McDonald, I think, is probably one of the ones that stands out, who became interested relatively late in life.
Right.
But it's probably hard to persuade him. There have been a few, but it's puzzling. When in some of the times, like when you get Dr. Conant, who wasn't interested and is basically forced to look into UFOs, you don't necessarily like the answers that are given.
Right.
I wanted to compare a couple of things. So the Conant report, that the government was supposed to be looking into UFOs. Ufologists were really interested. John Schuessler wrote an article about how great this was going to be, and obviously the results didn't please him. And Nick was talking about the Roswell report in the 90s. Was that you, Campbell?
I mentioned it briefly.
Yeah. So that was actually at the there was pressure from Senator Schiff, but it was President Clinton that actually gave the push for that to happen. And so that was supposed to be a good government investigation, and everybody, there was the expectation this will prove Roswell, and then it was quite the opposite. And so now we've got another government involvement. We had Blue Book and where these others have gone. I don't see the outcome being much different. At best, it's going. If it's not negative, which it may be, it's going to be inconclusive, and it's just the wheels turning.
Well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. Louise, Nick, do you have any final questions for Curt before we wrap up?
No final questions, but I really want everyone who's watching or watching later, if you guys haven't checked out both of Curt's blogs, I really recommend you do. They're both really excellent.
Louise, do you have anything?
No, I second that.
Excellent. Curt, do you have any final thoughts for us about your journey through the UFO subject?
Oh, well, it is a journey. So, and, some people say there's not an end in sight. So, keep an open mind. It's hard to do sometimes. You're going to face a lot of disappointment. And, if you're interested in UFOs, just be prepared. Most cases crumble. There's either insufficient evidence. You'll find that it's a fake. There are some genuine mysteries. Try to remain positive. And, for your mental health, have some other hobbies, something that you can complete and with a satisfying answer, because you're not going to get that very often with UFOs.
Excellent advice. Wise words.
Yeah, absolutely. And just your social media links, Curt. We do have your Twitter and your 2 websites in the show notes. Is there anything else you'd like to plug right now?
Oh, well, if I love to have feedback, you find out what people are interested, what they'd like to see more of. In the Saucers at Time Forgot, I try to expose people to little known things. I usually avoid things like Roswell. So I want to, and some of the pioneers of ufology, I'd like to focus on them. So, it's, and, some of them are kind of, there's some hoaxes that have been exposed. There's some of them are kind of humorous. So there's a little something for everyone. I hope people will check it out.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for finally coming on.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
really glad we got you on here.
Yeah, cheers. And I'll close this off now and roll the credits. So our first episode without Leah Prime in the pilot's seat worked okay.
Yeah, right. Who
Although,
needs her?
Well, we're all looking forward to her return next week. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. But all right, everybody, this has been awesome.
Cool.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Oops, that's the wrong one.